Well, good morning. Today we're finishing up our series on the prophet Elisha, around 900 BC, or if you prefer BCE. But we're finishing up today. Elisha's going to die. So there's the end of the sermon. Death and taxes, it's like, I always say, death is undefeated, right? Death's never lost, except one time, and so that's what's important about looking at Elisha's life, because it points to the life that can never be ended, which is Elisha points unmistakably to Jesus Christ 900 years later. The end of Elijah's life's a little bit fanciful. And I was having a conversation with someone this week who is quite skeptical of Christianity, and his chief objection was the fact that when he reads the Bible, he feels like he's reading like a kid's book. That there's the Red Sea is parting, there's manna coming from heaven, dead people are popping back up from life, and there's all these, it does. I actually sympathize with the man. It seems fanciful. It seems, well, to use his term, because this guy I was talking with had been struggling with the death of one of his children, which had happened a long time ago, but he said, listen to this, he said, it seems too good to be true. So there's a lot that goes into a statement like that. And that's exactly, when I was in college and I was going through my atheist agnostic phase, that's exactly what I thought too. And I remember, for those of you who've come to church on Easter, you probably know that personal story of mine when I was in undergrad, when I was at college. And I was struggling, and like probably every 20, 21-year-old does in college. And I started to, it's crazy enough, I was living with a couple of guys, and I remember, like, I was going to my room. By the way, I lived in a walk-in closet in college with like a hot water heater in there, so there was just enough room for a bed. It prepared me for life in the Navy is what it did. And, on a ship where you just have a small little rack. And I remember seeing a book by one of my boxes that I'd never read, but it was C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. And I picked that up and read it. It started to intrigue me, really started to warm my heart in some way to God, but I was still a long way off. And I remember talking to my psychology professor. His name was Dr. Jesse Nolf. I really loved him. He was an older guy, bald guy, with the kind of your typical, you'd think of like professor from like the 50s. He had the black horn-rimmed glasses and wore a suit every day to class, and would sit out behind the building and he would puff on cigarettes. And so that's where I went and talked to him. By the way, that's always, if you ever get into ministry in the military, that's the best place to do ministry, as we say, at the smoke pit. Because people are just back there smoking, and you could show up and just start talking about stuff, and they're amenable to conversations anyway. So was Dr. Nolf. He was amenable to this conversation. He was open to it. And I started to talk with him and about Christianity. He was not a believer. And he said to me, so Dan, you're exploring this thing. Yeah. And I said, yeah. I was not one of his prize students either. And he said, so you believe all that is true? And I said, I don't know, I think so. I said, don't you, Dr. Nolf? And he says, oh, no. I don't believe that. I think it's all fanciful, like a fish story that got bigger and bigger and bigger as it was retold. He was speaking about Jesus, right? And I said, I don't know why it popped out of my little 20-year-old mind, but I said, I did something good. It was a good question. And I still can't believe that came out of my mind 29 years ago. And I said, so you don't believe that, Dr. Nolf? And he said, no. And I said, well, have you ever thought, maybe, what if you're wrong? And he kind of stepped back and put his hand on his chin like that. He'd never even thought about that. What if you're wrong? He goes, well, then I'm wrong about everything, he said. And then I said, but yeah, what if Jesus was who he said he was? I mean, the Bible's pretty clear of what Jesus said about himself. He said, I am the bread of life. He who eats and drinks of me will never go hungry, never go thirsty again. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. I mean, in other words, do you see the claims that Jesus is making is that if he is who he said he is, then obviously your soul needs him, like the body needs food, or else it will shrivel. It's the same concept. And he said to me, well, he goes, for me, Dan, where I would look if I were you, he said, I would look at Jesus' resurrection. Now, if that happened, if that actually happened, he said, if a dead man physically in some capacity, I don't know how, he said, came back to life, he goes, then he is truly the vine and we are the branches. Then that's that. He said, if he rose from the dead, all of Christianity is true. If he didn't rise from the dead, none of Christianity is true. I thought so it hinges on that. He goes, yeah, that's where I would look if I were you. So I did. And I spent the next 29 years doing that. Up until even now. Culminating in a doctoral dissertation on that very topic. And I remember the first draft of my doctoral dissertation. This is what you learn in academia. All the red ink, well, it was in computer red ink, not like pen red ink. Now, in red ink, you know what it was? You can't just assert things. You have to cite you have to cite this. You have to cite this. You have to give justification for the things that you say. You can't just blandly assert things. And so my dissertation ended with over 390 citations, historical citations, just concerning around historically what we can know with certainty would happen around the resurrection of Jesus Christ, without making a faith claim that Jesus rose from the dead. But what could we know? Let's say we're not a believer, we're not an unbeliever, we're just trying to approach the data, which no one can really do, mind you. We're just trying to approach the data as objectively as possible. And basically, here's the gist of it. Because you're going to get a fanciful story from Elisha, and you're going to be like, I don't believe all that stuff. There's basically depending upon how I tell it, around 7 to 12 facts that you could know with certainty, historically, what happened. None of them are faith claims, none of them are theological. This is all historical research. And for those of you who've done historical research, it's a lot like doing detective work. You listen to eyewitness testimony, you accumulate evidence, you weigh the evidence, you weigh the testimony, and that's how you look for statements that corroborate, you look for multiple attestation of statements. Multiple attestation means that two different people attest to something without colluding on it. You look, the two biggest things you'll learn in doing historical research is that you look for two E's. You want early testimony and you want eyewitness testimony. And eyewitness testimony, although can be flawed, I always respond, someone said that to me, well, eyewitness testimony could be flawed too. I said, yeah, would you prefer I use non-eyewitness testimony? Well, no. Okay. So basically what I'm going to give you is a summation of that dissertation. And by the way, listen to this, that 98% of all scholars in the field would agree with me. That's pretty stunning because the evidence is so overwhelming. I'm not going to go through all the evidence with you. I'm just going to give you why scholars are so certain that these 5 to 7 facts are so very conclusive. And by the way, in the world of the academy, what I mean that, not like the Army or Navy, but I mean in academia, I'm talking about institutions like Harvard, Cambridge, Oxford, Tübingen, we'll throw the Germans in there, Tübingen, University of Berlin, the premier academic institutions for all other fields in the world too. Half of those scholars would consider themselves atheist or agnostic. They would all agree with what I'm going to tell you right now. Isn't that wild? In the world of academia, no one's disagreeing about this. They disagree about the conclusions you could draw from it, but no one's disagreeing with the data itself and the certainty you could have about these historical facts. I'll go quick. Number one, we could be historically certain that Jesus died by crucifixion under the reign of a Roman governor named Pontius Pilate. That's with certainty. You don't need the Bible for that. We can know that with certainty outside of the Bible. There's a great book, if you're interested in reading, by a PhD from Union Theological Seminary, high-class intellect named Robert Van Voorst. He wrote a book called Jesus Outside the New Testament. And the data within the first century, outside of the New Testament, is absolutely overwhelming. There's a scholar, he's a very respected scholar named John Dominic Crossan. He was a member of the Jesus Seminar. He said the fact that Jesus Christ died by death, or Jesus of Nazareth died by crucifixion under the rule of Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea at that time, in and around AD 30, he said is the most certain fact we have in the history of Greco-Roman history. That's crazy. Why? Because it's so multiply attested. It's not only attested within the New Testament, which is data, it's also attested by Tacitus, first century source, late first century, early second century source, Roman historian, not just some writer, a Roman historian. Josephus, Jewish historian, working for the Roman Empire within the first century. Pliny the Younger, who was a Roman governor. I mean, this book, Jesus Outside of the New Testament, you find very interesting. That's fact number one, Jesus died by crucifixion. Fact number two, Jesus' disciples or his followers had post-mortem appearances of him after his death, thus post-mortem. They saw him alive after his death in some way, right? As a historian, you would say, maybe it was a hallucination, maybe it was a vision, I don't know. But they did have experiences that they interpreted, this is the qualifier, watch now, they had post-mortem experiences of Jesus that they interpreted as of the risen Jesus Christ back from the dead. Fact. No one debates that they had those experiences because of the data. No, I don't have time to get into that. If you want to know more, call me, email me. I'd love to have coffee with you and explain it further. Number three, that the tomb was found to be empty. Why are scholars so conclusive on that? Well, because we know that, because of the fourth fact, that the preaching of Jesus' resurrection started in Jerusalem. Well, why does that make data for the tomb being empty? Because Jesus was buried in Jerusalem. It's kind of hard to preach that the guy had been raised from the dead when he's buried 2 blocks away. You see what I'm saying? So it's like, that's a pretty easy religious claim to go fact check and disprove. It's like, Grandma Miller's been raised from the dead. Oh, good. She's buried over at New Tacoma. Why don't we just go look and see? Oh, Grandma Miller's still in there. There's her raggedy old bones, so obviously that's not true. Even, early in the first century, or mid to late first century, when the Gospel of Matthew was written, in Matthew's Gospel, he conveys to us that there was a Jewish apologetic at the time, a non-Christian apologetic, which they had to come up with a theory for the empty tomb. Enemy attestation, that's another historical criteria. The enemies of Christianity conceded to the Christians that the tomb was empty. So there's four facts right here. Here's fifth one for you ladies. Women were the first witnesses of the risen Jesus and went to the tomb first. Why are we so certain about that? The Gospels tell us this, and we know that historically that those accounts go way back, especially Mark's version of it. There's a pre-Mark and Passion narrative that dates back to within just a couple years of Jesus, of the cross. And no one would have ever recorded that women were the first witnesses had it not be true, because women weren't even allowed to testify in court at that time. So if you're inventing a religion, why would you invent a religion and cut your legs off the minute you invent it? Because your witnesses are specious. As a matter of fact, there's a right around mid-second century Roman philosopher, and he said, this is basically why you can't believe Christianity, he says, is because women were the first witnesses, and we all know women are crazy. Sorry, ladies, Not that I agree with him, but what I'm saying is that, totally, I agree with him, I guess, but what he is saying is that, look, he's conceding the fact that was the case. That's fact number 5. There's more surrounding this that we could give, but when you start to look at the facts and you start to come up with an explanation of the facts, it sure looks like something really crazy happened there. Here's the last one I'll give you, and I could give you a dozen more, but here's the last one. There were Jewish rebellions, Messiah movements all throughout the first couple of centuries, the 2nd century BC, 3rd century BC, 1st century BC, 1st century AD, 2nd century AD, 3rd century AD, all around Jesus' life. I think there's somewhere close to 100 different Messiah movements that popped up in and around Israel at that time. And remember, you guys were here on Easter. Do you remember the pattern? Someone claims to be the Messiah. They gather followers around them. They go and confront the Romans, or in the before the Roman Empire, the Greeks. And the Romans kill that Messiah leader, and the movement dies. And that happened 100 times. And Jesus' pattern fits it perfectly. There's a guy who claims to be the Messiah. He gathers followers around him. He confronts, he goes, in essence, right, in confrontation with the Romans. The Romans kill the Messiah guy, and the movement dies. No, the movement explodes to the point of billions. You see, it totally breaks the historical pattern, and so now as a historian, you can't look at faith, but you got to say, okay, something weird happened here, something anomalous, something that is not normal, something that contradicts a pattern, which at least, at a very minimum, I told the guy I was talking to, at least you should investigate that a little bit. That's something that's so anomalous. Furthermore, it's not only anomalous, the one who we're claiming that about claimed that he is the way, the truth, and the life. And so if you couple that with claim and with the historical data, you got a little bit of a Jesus problem on your hands there. So this is not fairy tales. And so when Jesus Christ talks about the Old Testament, it's like we say, if there's a guy who could predict his own death and resurrection and pull it off, we go with whatever he says. And so if he talked about the Old Testament, then I'm going to pay attention to the Old Testament. If Jesus talked about Elijah, then I'm going to look at Elijah. If there's a guy who could predict his own death and resurrection and pull it off, we're going to listen to him. And so here's the story from Elijah. I'll be quick because, you guys, we got 4 baptisms today. And if you leave, I'm going to call my Navy SEAL buddies. We're going to track you down, and we're going to go after you, and we're going to zip tie you and put a black hood over your head. You got to stay for our baptisms. Now, if this was a fairy tale, by the way, really quick, I'm going to go through this fast. So, I have one of my kids used to say, "Dad, you talk too fast." And you know what my response is? Well, you listen too slow. So I'm going to go fast. You need to listen fast, all right? Elisha, if they were making this up, what do you think they would say about his death? You get a couple guesses. What would you say? This is not rhetorical. What would you say? How did Elisha's boss die? Elijah. Chariot went up into heaven. Play Chariots of Fire. The Chariots of Fire. That. So you would expect, if you're making a story up, what? Something like that. You don't get that. It's garden variety, normal, look. Now, Elisha had been suffering from the illness from which he died. What? There's a little bit more to it than that. That's not the only Bible verse we're going to look at today. We'll be quick, though. And so Jehoash, who was an evil, bad king of Israel, and we know historical records from this guy that's outside of the Old Testament as well, went down to see him and wept over him. My father, he cried, the chariots and horsemen of Israel," which is exactly what Elisha said when his boss, Elijah, which is who you're named after he died, after he was taken up into heaven. So you're thinking it's going to be the same chariots of fire, major heavenly, apocalyptic, cool, godly, heavenly vision type thing. Elisha said, hey, forget about that stuff. Get a bow and some arrows, and he did so. Take the bow in your hands, he said to the king of Israel. When he had taken it, Elisha put his hands on the king's hands. Open the east window, he said, and he opened it. He said, shoot, Elisha said, and he shot. The Lord's arrow of victory, the arrow of victory over Syria, Aram. Elisha declared, you will completely destroy the Arameans at Aphek. Okay. Then he said, take the arrows, and the king took them. Elisha told him, strike the ground. He struck it 3 times and stopped. This is weird. The man of God was angry with him and said, you should have struck the ground 5 or 6 times. Then you would have defeated Aram and completely destroyed. But now you only defeated 3 times. You weren't completely obedient. And then Elisha died and was buried. Doesn't the Bible suck? I mean, that's what you would think. This is so anticlimactic. It's so uncinematic. It's so unceremonious, unfairy tale-ish. It's cool lesson to learn here is that Elisha died basically doing something he'd been doing his whole life. There was no amazing lightsaber fight with Darth Vader. There was no blowing up at the Death Star. Okay, I'll get out of the Star Wars motif. There's no, knocking out Apollo Creed and winning the heavyweight champion of the world for Rocky. No, you know what I'm saying? No climactic, big event. Roy Hobbs hitting the home run. He was a left-hander. Hitting the home run, winning it for the New York Knights, which if you've not seen the movie The Natural, you're a deprived person, with Robert Redford, who I was just told passed away a couple weeks ago. But that's a great baseball movie, The Natural. There's no Kevin Costner playing catch with his dad on the Field of Dreams, Jimmy Chitwood hitting the winning jumper in Hoosiers with Gene Hackman, who also just died. All the movie stars I like are dying. Nothing like that. He died and was buried. That is so weird. And get this, he dies, but that's not the end of his influence, which, by the way, is a great thing for you to remember. There was a study done a number of years ago, like 25 years ago, and they interviewed, I think, 50 people aged 95 and above. Now, the reason there's probably only 50 is, the talent pool's a little bit dry with 95 and older. And they asked him, if you had to go and live your life, you're 95 years over again, what would you do different? And 3 answers popped up. This is good for you guys to hear. 3 things that they all overwhelmingly stated. Number 1, they said they would risk more. I played it too safe throughout my life. I didn't take a shot. I didn't take the shot. I didn't throw the punch. I didn't call him and played catch with him on the baseball field. I didn't take the swing. I kind of just froze. I would risk more. I would take more shots. I would put my heart out there more. I would put my heart on my sleeve more. I would listen more at church, maybe as a shot. I wouldn't just sit there like this, looking like a bent, upright corpse. I would take more risks, you guys. That's number 1. Number 2, they said they would let me get to that. That's 3. Number 2, they would reflect more. In other words, these 95-year-olds were saying, I whizzed through life too fast. I didn't take time to step back and say, what a moment. This is awesome. This is great. Here I am with my kids. Here I am marrying the woman that I love. Here I am getting baptized. They would risk more and they would reflect more. Instead of just putting your head down and going to your cubicle and typing on a keyboard and going home and going to sleep and getting up and repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat and repeat. In other words, they get to their 95th year and they're saying, damn it, I wish I wouldn't have done that. Not that that's wrong. They're just saying that I would have just reflected more. My grandpa used to say when I was a kid, you guys, I remember being just a teenager, and he would say, Dan, you're just going to blink and you're going to be my age. I see the gray hair. Is that true? You guys, you're just going to, it's gone. Doesn't it seem just, you parents out here with teenagers, just a year ago, seems like just yesterday, they were right here. And now they're right here. That's risk more, reflect more. And the third thing they said is they would do more. They would invest their time in things that would go on beyond their death. They wouldn't just live a life for personal gain. They would live a life that meant something. That meant something more than just your 80 years. That went beyond that. Scripture talks about this all the time, guys. You're not meant to live for that. That's called sin, just living for yourself. That's the difference between having a job, a career, and a vocation. You know what the Latin word vocatio, where we get the word vocation, comes from? It means a calling. A job is a job. That's like, have you seen the movie Office Space? You walk in, you punch the ticket, you sit down there, and you get harassed by your bosses asking why you didn't put the proper cover sheet on your TPS report. And you're like, ugh. Some of you are in this. A vocation means you could do the very same thing at the very same company with the very same TPS reports, but you have a calling to be there from God and a gift from God to be there, and it's a divine appointment and it's a divine calling rather than a job that's for personal fulfillment. It's a calling, a vocatio from God. What's the difference? Depression and joy? Is that a big enough difference for you? Death and life? Is that a big enough difference for you? What happens to Elisha after his death? Something goes on for him after his death. By the way, you're proof of it. We're here today, 3,000 years later. Check this out. Once while some Israelites were burying a man, suddenly they saw a band of raiders, so they threw the man's body into Elisha's tomb. He's already dead, yeah. When the body touched Elisha's bones, the man came to life and stood up on his feet. Just getting near Elijah, bang. See, that's the fanciful stuff. But the overarching message is that Elisha's influence continues even from his grave and thousands of years later to you and to me. Because he pointed to the one who conquered the grave. That's what that shows. Look at Elisha is a servant of God. God's going to send Jesus Christ 900 years after this, and there's going to be a tomb that when God sends the final prophet, priest, and king, who is Jesus Christ, they're going to throw him into a tomb, and no one's going to be, and that tomb's going to end up empty. Elisha was still in his tomb. Jesus Christ's not going to be. And that's the beautiful thing, is that when we're thrown into the tomb, yours is going to get empty too, because the one who was raised from the dead made a promise to you that when you're thrown into the tomb, I'm going to come and take you to where I am. And so there, where I am, there you shall be also. That's the promise of the one who conquered all tombs, not just Elisha. So in other words, you guys, if you're discouraged today, I'm coming to the end, FYI. If you're discouraged today, if you're distraught, or if you're bitter, or resentful, or just tired, or if you're sitting here and you're young and you're bored, you got to remember, you got to fight boredom as much as you would fight unbelief, because it's not from God. We say in our church, you guys, it's a sin to be boring. It's a sin to bore someone with the kingdom of God. I think it's also a sin to entertain people with the kingdom of God too. So there's a sweet spot you got to navigate. But at the end of the Apostle Paul's life, here's someone who risked, reflected, and a lot lived on after him because of the one he served. Not because of the way he lived, but because of the one he served. And he lived because the one he served promised that he would be with him and he would never die again. Jesus Christ, physically raised from the dead. And so Paul can serve with newness of life, a peace of God that passes all understanding, a heart and a hope that this world can't touch, and a victory that is unassailable and can never be taken away. It's 4 zeros on the scoreboard. Everyone who trusts in Christ has already won. That's why C.S. Lewis said, Christians never have to say goodbye. You know what Christians could say? Till we meet again. And this is what Paul said at the very end of his life. I want you to hear this. He said, for I'm already being poured out like a drink offering. That's a fancy way of saying I'm going to be killed. And the time for my departure is near. That's another fancy way of saying I'm going to be killed. I have fought the good fight. I have finished the race. What? I've kept the faith. Translation, I went through trouble. I went through hardship. I went through stonings. I went through beatings. I went through imprisonments. And he's telling Timothy, the guy who's going to take over for him, and I didn't give up the ship. Paul's saying to you, it's a fancy way of saying, don't give up the ship, which is a Navy saying from Captain James Lawrence. Let me tell you the story again. I have a video to conclude to show you. James Lawrence in the War of 1812, in the battle, he was on the USS Chesapeake, Battle of Lake Erie. I learned something about this battle too, and I've been in the Navy 23 years, and I learned about it something Friday night. James Lawrence, the British were boarding his ship, and it's war, and he was mortally wounded. And as he was lying there dying, he said to his men, last words before he died, don't give up the ship. In other words, what? Fight the good fight. Finish the race. Keep the faith, men. That's what he said. And you know what happened? His whole crew was killed. And the ship got captured. Do you know what also happened months later, 2 years later, also in the War of 1812? The United States won. See, Paul's saying, fight the good fight, finish the race, keep the faith. It doesn't mean your life is always going to win. It just means that your life is now attached to the one who ultimately has won already. That who will never lose. That's Jesus Christ. And so Paul is saying, no matter what hits you now, and life is going to hit, don't give up the ship, you guys. It's so easy to quit, especially when things get hard. Don't quit. Don't give up the ship, even if Paul ends up being killed for the ship. And you know what's crazy? One of the chief metaphors of early Christianity, do you know what it was? Especially for the church of Christians? A ship. That's why churches like the ones, the sanctuary, the chapel we have upstairs, is shaped the way it is because they're supposed to be like that. It's shaped like Noah's Ark. The church is supposed to be an ark in turbulent seas of this world. Isn't that crazy? And so this is not just a Navy saying, this is a Jesus saying. You're in the ark right now, and you'll be in it when you leave this building. This building is not the ship. Jesus Christ's victory and his love for you is. Don't give it up. I know some of you are in the midst of maybe wanting to quit, whether it's life or, marriage or life's treating you unfair. Here's Jesus Christ. How could I say it any clearer for you today? Here's Jesus Christ saying, don't give up the ship. I've already won. And as a matter of fact, last week, what did we learn about Elisha when his assistant thought that they were surrounded and they were all going to die? What did Elisha say? Lord, open his eyes. And what did Elisha's servant then see? Billions of God's angels surrounding them. He didn't see it. Thus, don't give up the ship. You have the power of heaven behind you. You have the power of the never-ending life of Jesus Christ and his sure and certain promise behind you. Now ain't the time to quit. He didn't quit on you, and he never will. So don't give up the ship. So last thing I want to show you. Yes, sir. Yeah, I like that. A little interaction. I'm an insecure speaker, so we don't interact. The last thing I wanted to show you, this is really cool, and there's a video I'm going to show you.